All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's podcast. And my name is Michelle. Let me first introduce myself a little bit. I'm a translator with the Chenyu's English Sub for a couple of years. And today we are very honored to have invited Donna from Canada to be part of our guest for today's podcast. And Donna, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit to our fans and audiences?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you for including me in today's podcast. My name is Donna. I live in Canada, and I'm a mental health therapist and addiction counselor. I was very fortunate to watch parts of Singer 2018, which is where I was introduced to Chenyu's music. And the deeper I dug into his music, the more fascinating I found it to be, not just because he's an amazing artist and incredible singer, but also because of his composition and the way he was so giving to the fans regarding the meaning of his lyrics, and also invited us into his inner world. I worked just a little bit with the editors, but not very much, but mostly my introduction to the Martian family has been through Facebook and through Discord. So thank you again for inviting me today.
Yes, we are very honored to have you here. And you just mentioned a couple points that sounds very interesting to us, to the rest of the Martians, in the sense that how do you find that his music is able to expose his inner world, and what this kind of inner world is in your way of perceiving it, and how has it affect people in your observation?
I think for one thing, we find out very early on, and when I became interested in him, then I went back and watched earlier videos, particularly the documentary that was aired during the Superboy competition, when it talked about how this is the first time we really learned about his childhood and upbringing. And so one of the things I noticed in the videos is that he spent a lot of time alone, and his friends on Superboy also spent a lot of time trying to draw him in, trying to engage him, taking care of him. Mm-hmm. And then when we discovered during the documentary that this was a young boy who spent a lot of time alone, his mm-hmm. father was busy, mm-hmm. the family was broken, and mm-hmm. so his inner world became his only world, really. Mm-hmm. So I think the theme to me that I noticed right away was just, I guess if I would encapsulate it, it would be lonely.
Right. And in your experience, or in your from your perspective, how does this loneliness has either informed or expressed through his music? Or could you give us a few examples? Yeah. No?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of the early songs that really caught me, and also some of the other fans I've talked to mm-hmm. have also pointed to mm-hmm. the words from Ashes from Fireworks. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at that, even though he didn't compose it, mm-hmm. In the second stanza, it says, "I shouldn't be alone, falling in a trance. Only I am guarding the quiet desert." Mm-hmm. And then he goes on to say, "Only I look at others' happiness." So there's a lot of references to just me being alone. And so to me, that was sort of the first introduction mm-hmm. of his perception of loneliness. Mm-hmm. And then when we begin to read the lyrics of the mm-hmm. things that he composed, which are more autobiographical, mm-hmm. is that where's the one that says where he talks about being an elderly child, and this is also mm-hmm. in Ashes, mm-hmm. That he lets us know at that time mm-hmm. that his early experiences mm-hmm. have created this inner child within him mm-hmm. that moves with him through all the stages of life, that is still there mm-hmm. and really a bit injured. I'm wondering if you agree with that.
Yes, definitely. I think childhood affects a person throughout their lives, and we often forget nowadays. He's an adult man, but we often forgot that he grew up in a background that affects his whole way of approaching life. and affects his music, but not always in a negative way, because his struggle is just intensified when it's compared to a average person. And that intensification brought out a kind of awareness of the inner struggles that we all have to a certain degree. That's just my way of seeing it.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that we can't really overlook is, you know, in behavioral science and psychology, we often pay attention to people's mental health as a result of how they attach as a child to caregiving relationships. So when you think about his father being busy and absent and his mother being separated from the family, and so he didn't have anyone to really help him interpretate all of these feelings. And so it made him go inward. And so the people that he depended on most to help him make sense of the world and what he was experiencing were not there. And so he really created his own interpretations of himself and the world around him.
Right. Yes, definitely. And definitely, I can't agree anymore. But I think his interpretation of the world is a kind of narrative from his own unique perspective, and which is the one that is interestingly always show a kind of wisdom that is beyond his age, in a sense. So maybe in some ways he's immature in the sense that he's not with a mom who constantly reminds you a certain set of ideas that allow you to take a perspective that's more fitting to the environment. But on the other hand, he developed his own set of rules and ideas about how to interpret the world around him, and that informed his music, especially the early phases that when he described either the insignificant self, or in the second album a very the big self in his own world. So that I found that interesting. I'm just wondering your thought on these developments.
He certainly leads us through a progression of himself, where he talks about his inner world in the early works, and almost some of it, like when you think of Alien, there's a rather angry undertone to that, and that is, you're going to listen to me.
Right.
And not ignore me any longer.
Right.
Whereas with Ashes, it tends to be, I'm here alone, who's paying attention to me? Am I alone guarding the desert, the quiet desert? And then you begin to see this progression of his music in which he's inviting you in, rather than, in the beginning, he feels like a bystander to his own world, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
And then he begins to invite us in, and then it gets bigger. Focuses it begins to focus more on the macro rather than the micro.
Right, definitely.
Yeah, and then one of the things that I think, particularly as Western listeners and Western fans, that has been really helpful, and honestly, the whole Martian group has been part of this, in that we begin to understand more the Chinese influence, the philosophical influences, the cultural influences that help us as global fans understand more, not just from the purely developmental and psychological aspects of someone growing up with his background, but also then the cultural, philosophical contributors to who he is. And those of us who are more global fans, non-Asian, it's been invaluable to be part of this group that has shed so much insight on to help us understand his songwriting.
Yes, definitely. I'm very glad to be part of that effort because it's also a process for me to explore all these different literature and different, contexts that has informed him in writing his music. And I definitely see a lot of philosophical influence. And the most prominent one, I think, would be the attitude of going with the flow. He always say, take it easy, do one thing at a time. That's the most recent interview. He says something like, the biggest thing is to be persistent. Is not a big thing. It's scattered in every day. Like every day you just do something to persist. Then you eventually get to where you want to go. So that definitely echoes a lot with the Taoist philosophy of going with the flow. Every step start from you start 1,000 miles from a single step. That kind of philosophy has influence. And then he does give an example of himself engaging in this process through a lot of personal up and downs, but nevertheless, he was able to always focus on music, or at least he's telling us he's focused on music because his environment, we understand there could be distractions, but he's always anxious in telling us that he's focused on music. That's what I sense. So it's very, very illuminating through his interviews. And also his music, I think it has a lot of reference to the yin and yang, the balance of the opposing forces that forms the universe, basically, in Arrival and in God Tree. That's the two opposite counterbalance of life form that informed his music, basically. So that's also very interesting.
So as a Western fan of his music,
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious,
Mm-hmm.
when you look at other post-90s or 90s
Mm-hmm.
musicians in China, do you see this depth of development of philosophical and psychological influences to music, to contemporary music?
Maybe there are some underground musicians who are also informed by these philosophical, influences. But in terms of popular music that can be reached to the common audience, I cannot really recall anything out of my mind. So I think he's very unique in that he stands out. That almost nobody really talk about these topics at a level that he was able to express. So that's very, very unique. I think in the cultural tradition, there were rock and roll. There was a generation in the 80s, early 80s and early 90s that they were that when China first opened up to the Western music, they brought in rock and roll, and it's just a very fresh perspective that was brought into the music scene. And at that time, for example, Fake Monk was a work that was created there then. And but it was more of a culture clash between East and West. It's about when we first learn about you and you first learn about me, that kind of clash. But it's not so much going back to the tradition. It's the vein behind all these development is not about the tradition. So in Hua Chenyu's music, I found a strain that was through his development that was actually going back to the Chinese tradition of traditional culture. So that's very, very unique.
So really it was the 90s
Mm-hmm.
when more Western music became available to the general public of China. Is that correct?
Yes, that's very correct. I think at the late 80s and then early 90s was a period that a lot of English songs get to played in the music stations, and also a lot of artists was singing cover songs of English songs at that time. And I think Hua was informed by those Western music. He said that he grew up with listening to bands like Muse or Radiohead. So he's definitely influenced by those music. So he found a sort of maybe a genre that he identifies with, but he channels a lot of the sort of the Chinese perspective through it. So it's very unique in that sense.
And I think that's where it's so fascinating to us who are in the West to understand more of these philosophical, these Asian influences to contemporary music that is rap and rock. And when I think about, say, the American music from the storytellers and the people who had perhaps social justice focus,
Right.
or, you know, some of the change makers in political and cultural components of musicians. I think of some of the early ones like Arlo Guthrie and, and even Bruce Springsteen. Right. These are the people who brought attention to social issues. And then you have the rock era, which also brought more emotional, harder emotion. And then you've got people like Dolly Parton and Emily Paris, people like that who are storytellers. And so they began to normalize the display of emotions, or the ability to tell a story that included emotions and current events in music. And I think this is where what Chenyu has done so beautifully is that his vulnerability to let us see his inner world and understand the emotions that he lives with has really been amazing, particularly since it's more of a new concept to China. Is that correct?
I think just the rock music is, like I said, was introduced more and popularized more in the late 80s and early 90s, or when Hua Chenyu was growing up. So definitely there's a clash of the genre and the energy, the free energy that's in the music. And for him, combined with his philosophical thoughts, his explorations in those philosophical thoughts, as combined together, it forms the inner core of his music, in my opinion. So that's very unique. It's a very unique cultural phenomenon, in my opinion, and that's ultimately very universal in the sense that that part of the Chinese tradition is about universal principles that's actually pretty popularized in Western world as well. I think nowadays there are a lot of mindless practice and Taoist lectures on the YouTube. I didn't realize it's so popular right now. So in a sense, it creates a channel to sort of that appeals to Chinese audience and also Western audience, because it's really something that's universal. I have to say hello to Barbara. She just joined us in the podcast.
Yes.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
My apologies. I was thinking, I don't know why, I was thinking my group ended at 11.
Oh, okay.
Ended at 11:30, but I let him go early today so I could jump over here.
Oh, no worry. It's a podcast, so we're not so rigid. It's more of a free discussion, and whatever you feel like, you can chime in. But why don't you introduce you to us, to our audience, and maybe let us know a little bit of the background work that you're doing.
Okay, I work with domestic violence and child abuse treatment in the form of having groups, which we meet weekly, and everyone's in the group for 52 weeks. Well, some of the groups I do through, that's done through probation, people who are on probation. Some of the groups that I work with are through social services, so most of them have had their kids taken away from them. They're trying to get them back, so some of those come for 16 weeks.
Okay. Barbara, have we lost you? Hello?
Pardon? Yes.
Okay, good. Go ahead. We were just wondering. Donna and I was talking about, where we were. I think we were talking about what's the background that informed Hua's music. I said we mentioned one part of the influences from the Western rock music that was introduced in the late 90s, and another part is his spiritual development through philosophical aspects in Taoism and in many other traditional Chinese philosophies. And he has a trajectory of development from beginning to maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And then nowadays, his thinking has kept on changing, and there's a train of thought. But these are combined together to form his music. So that was the topic we were on. Okay.
And that's so exciting to watch.
Right.
It really is. And I'm not sure what your thoughts are, Barbara, but to me, as a mental health clinician, one of the things I've always been curious about is the perhaps attachment injury that he experienced as a child. And these, as he calls them, perpetual feelings of being a lonely man, how much that's influenced his artistry and writing.
Yeah. Well, as much as I hate to say this because I feel so badly for how he was growing up, I feel that he had no one telling him what to think. And so everything he's come up with has been his own experience, his own watching, looking with open eyes at the world around him. And that to me has made everything he sings about so special. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I think you're so right. And that's one thing.
One of the things that led me to Hua Shenyu was Dimash. I found Dimash first. And the thing I'm most thankful for to Dimash is leading me to Hua Shenyu. Because, when you listen to interviews with Dimash, he's always quoting somebody else. And he's had a family around him that's been so loving and so supportive. But his thinking is in line with what he's been taught. And even his beliefs that women should be at home taking care of the kids and that sort of thing have come from what he's been taught. Hua just comes from a purity to me that I quote him. I listen to his quotes. I mean, in my groups, I put up quotes. Every week we have a quote that we discuss, and we have some music that we talk about. So, I've quoted the living symbolism mentality. You guys know that quote. Whatever environment I find myself in, even if it's complicated, mentality is very simple. I will base everything I do as something I want to do and do it without difficulty. So we talk about that. It's not that he's quoting somebody else.
Right.
So
right.
And we talk about, because I tried to take them out of despair and anger and that sort of thing into happiness. But then Wawa made me think, if you can't reach happiness, if happiness seems too far, let's try to talk about how to live your life without worry. And so much comes from him. And I think had he had a different childhood, like Dimash's childhood, for instance, I don't think that he would be the same person. Although, I don't know, seems kind of a light in the universe. So maybe he would be anyway.
Definitely.
I have to laugh.
Oh, okay.
I have to laugh a little bit, Barbara, because I think Dimash brought most of us to Mars, actually. And then once we got to Mars, we didn't look back.
But I feel that you're spot on when you talk about there was no one to help him interpret himself or the world around him as a young child. And often we depend on that with caregiving relationships. And that's to help us interpret what's going on around us, why we're thinking what we're thinking. And he didn't have that. So I appreciate that you brought that up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to chime in a little bit. The perspective of interpreting everything by himself. Definitely, I want to just add on to a little bit because I think in Chinese philosophy, we always talk about that you have to have a heart of the child in order to perceive the world as it is. That's because when you grow up, you have a lot of concepts, and then you start to interpret the world from those perspectives that may or may not fit the reality as time moves on. So fortunately and unfortunately, because of upbringing, he was able to get that perspective that's different from most people, and as a result, we listen to his quotes. That's just my perspective on this. And Barbara, I was, you said you were discussing these codes and shared it with the group of men that you are working with. And can you share with us something, of course, something you can share about these people's inmates' reaction to these codes, and what do they think, and which song in particular that they reacted to with the most intense emotion?
Well, it's hard to say because
Mm-hmm.
different groups are different. And one of my groups is women.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the group I had this morning was women, and so I think they might look at him a little differently. They've actually asked, "Oh, could you play some Washing You?" So, I think
Sure.
they kind of see a cute guy there too. Um,
Right. Yeah, that's of
but
course. Mm-hmm.
Seek, I think I mentioned on the internet page.
Mm-hmm.
Seek brought a lot of discussion, and it was emotional. It brought tears, and I think that's because, as I mentioned on the page, some of these people have been kind of lost in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a lot about self-esteem, and self-esteem allows you to be the person who can go out into the world and seek
Mm-hmm.
and not worry, because home is behind you. You can always go back home, and it frees you to move forward. um, I think a lot of the guys in particular are finding themselves in places where they're getting older, and their lives have not brought them to a place they'd hoped they would be. And now they have this huge mountain they're trying to climb, and
Right.
it became very emotional for them. Um, Actually, in some of my groups before, I played dad. Last night was very emotional for the guys. I
Oh.
played dad, and
Mm-hmm.
that that was in a men's child abuse program, and a
Oh,
lot of domestic violence is involved in that. So,
mm-hmm.
yeah, that's a pretty heavy song.
Wow.
Actually, one of the dads messaged me and asked if I would send him the link to that.
Mm. Yes, that one was. I remember you were saying that in the beginning you wouldn't introduce that first because it's too intense, and you were
Hmm.
trying to ease it in.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was too intense.
and
Mm-hmm.
like uh, just recently we watched Why Nobody Fights,
Mm-hmm.
and that wasn't particularly emotional, but
Mm-hmm.
that was in that was in a parenting group, and talking about raising our kids so that they can be themselves. Actually, this did bring up a lot of discussion,
Mm-hmm.
about raising their kids to be accepting of who they really are, and look at your children and look at your expectations for them, and
Mm-hmm.
set aside your expectations to get to know who your child really is. What are their gifts?
Mm-hmm.
What is their path, and help them to find themselves. So interesting conversation, and that conversation, as conversations tend to do, led into a lot of well, I couldn't accept it if my child's gay, kind of thing.
Right.
And
Right.
we went down that whole path until,
Right.
hopefully some light was shed. But yeah, I mean, I'm just finding that Huahua is. I'm trying not to push Huahua too much. One of the
Right.
guys says,
Right.
"You really like him, don't you?"
Right. Definitely.
Oh, you
Sometimes
noticed?
that get yeah, people get suspicious. What's your
Yeah.
motive?
What is the motives? Yeah.
Yeah, what are motives?
Yeah.
We can't
Yeah.
tell. We have
No.
motive of introducing Eastern philosophy, okay? Nothing else. Pure.
Yeah. Yeah. But I have had people from China in my groups who are just so surprised and delighted that I know who Hua Shenyu is.
Ah,
That's very cool.
yes, yes,
You know him? They say to me.
yeah,
Yes. Yes, I do.
yeah. Yeah, I guess, yeah, because he doesn't have any like overseas promoting effort at all. So it's all a person through person kind of, you know, communication through personal communication or YouTube random algorithm that he pops up. And then we get to know him a little bit. And then I think in Singer 2018, it was a little bit easier because Dimash was a big phenomenon. And then Hua was associated with them. And then he got popped up a lot. But nowadays, I don't think this channel is open that much. So we definitely, it is not as easy to get his music out, and with the language barrier and with the all these barriers, so it's not easy. But for people who have discovered with him, what I found is that so many fans that has stayed with us throughout the 3 years that we started the operation on Facebook and YouTube, and stayed out all these time. It's just amazing how long people hang out, because usually fans get tired, listening to a few songs, and then they drop off and become not as active. And it definitely also happens on our group, but then the amount of people who actively participating consistently is just very impressive, even surprising to myself.
Well, yeah, I have to say, I think we should have an early Martian Appreciation Day, because I can't even express how much I appreciate the Martians who found him early on and carried this so that I would be able to find out who he was.
Right.
Because how long it took me, I didn't discover him until probably 2019.
I think we can be very fortunate for the power of YouTube.
Right. Oh yeah, YouTube, absolutely. But I think, oh my gosh, I wish I could have been there in 2013. I wish I could have been there for this entire journey. But it is what it is, and I didn't find out about him until a couple of years ago. But I'm so appreciative of those who were holding the light for us all.
Yeah, definitely. I think I also wish to have started early. I started in 2018 when Singer 2018 was on the air, and so I get a partial understanding of him, that when I was on the scene, he's into a stage that he's relatively depressed in his personal life and maybe professional life, but he's also a period that he's producing brilliant music. So and I always feel like I go back to his previous years music performance and his recordings, but the feeling is just different. Sometimes I cannot piece it totally together, how this person gradually developed to who he is nowadays. But nowadays I'm experiencing him on a almost daily basis. We heard so many news, up and downs, and it gave me a stronger sort of understanding of his music, basically, and identify with it in a stronger sense that allows me. So definitely, I really concur that sentiment that I wish I started a bit early.
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious what each of your thoughts are on his song Conversations with Children of Mars. Have you ever seen another artist invite their fans in to be part of a composition in which it's clear the relationship is so important, not only to the artist, but to the fans?
I've never seen anything like it. And as soon as you brought that up, I feel tears starting to come in my eyes, because so touching to me. That reactor, Bushy Mama?
All right, yeah.
I literally was just nagging her to watch that, because she really likes Hua Hua, and I think she gets him on a lot of levels. And I just wanted her to see. I mean, to me, especially with the trilogy, I don't know, to me, the trilogy was, about the depression, and then that, that madness coming out of it. And then, this love that helped him bring him out, is how I was seeing it. And I find it so beautiful. And I love seeing him sing it in person, but I really wanted her to watch the music video, because I felt like that really told the story that you don't get when you just hear him singing it in concert.
No.
Because in concert, I'm watching some people react to that in concert, and it seems like, well, did he just write the whole song and they're singing part of it? But no, that's not how it was at all. It's so beautiful.
Right. Oh, definitely me neither. I've never seen any artist that reach out to the fans and make this music about a community, because I think a lot of the artists are expressing their own emotions, their life journeys, and it's often a very small setting about their personal life. And sometimes, of course, there are artists who express about social issues. So, but then it's their opinion about the social issues, not necessarily an interaction between himself, the artist himself, and his contemporaries. So in this case, definitely, it's very candid, conversation about his own personal struggles and what the Martian means to him, why he needs the support, and probably it's just very hard to actually to be able to express yourself in front of so many people. I think that's very hard, and it's very unique. Definitely, I've never seen anything like that.
I think to me, one of the things that's so notable is the whole vulnerability of it. And I'm not sure any of you are aware of the American professor out of the University of Houston. Her name is Dr. Brene Brown. And she is a shame and vulnerability researcher. And she focuses on these messages of shame and not enough, not pretty enough, thin enough, famous enough, rich enough sort of messages that we get. And so this sort of holds us back from being authentically who we are. And so with Hua Chenyu, this breathtaking vulnerability that he is willing to share with us, such as I feel alone, and then going on to look at the composition of I really want to love this world, little love. He talks about his fears of being a perpetually lonely man. I deserve not having any friends. But then in conversations, being so clear to the fans that without the fans, he wouldn't have much feedback from his external world on how he's being perceived and how important he is. So to me, the whole marriage between the fans and an artist in conversations was one of the most unique, incredibly heartwarming compositions I've actually ever seen.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And I think, definitely. That point, I think, Donna, you brought up about this is his way of getting feedback from the outside world, almost like a family, which he didn't have growing up, is so true. And so, I get sentimental when I think about it. I have my own child and I love him so much. And I'm just thinking about the love I'm giving him daily, how much I care about him. And then he's not having that. And just thinking about that, it just makes me very sad. And he's definitely get some of those from his relationship with the fans. So he said, I'm very clingy to my fans. And then it gives you another meaning, another level of meaning when he says that. What the Martian means to him, it's just very different.
Very different, yes.
And they were very validating. I'm sorry, Barbara.
No, go ahead.
I guess one of the things I loved about that song, Conversations, is the validation that he got after each stanza. He sang and then they sang, he sang and then they sang, and everything they gave back to him was validation and support and love and comfort. So to me, they were giving him what really he had not gotten previously. Even from the industry, when you think about his struggles with the music industry and how invalidating that's been as an artist. And his fans basically in that whole song said, we have your back, we love you, we understand you. These things that upset you and are bothersome, they don't matter because we understand you, we care, we validate you.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
I don't know much about his the music industry in Hua. I really don't have any background on that. But maybe that's another discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I can start a whole new podcast on that about the music industry and what's the different strands of different styles or genres that's popular in the current music industry, and invite some fans who are knowledgeable about that and how Huahua's music stands in this environment. We can probably relay that discussion to another podcast, but definitely that's a huge topic as well. Well, I think the conversation went so well, and I even didn't notice the time, and it's 46 minutes already. So I think in the interest of keeping every podcast, to a good amount of time, we'll have to stop the conversation here today. But it's such a great conversation, and so grateful to have Barbara and Donna, to have you guys onto this podcast and share your thoughts, inner thoughts with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting
Thank you for inviting us. Yeah,
it.
thank you.
Thank you. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.